Good afternoon, late afternoon it is. This is Critical Talk with Professor Amna Aldine. I'm going to have to ask our listeners to excuse my voice. Chicago's weather is not cooperating with me, but I am pleased to have with me Doctors Nisa Muhammad and Yusuf Carter, and we're going to talk about freedom schools. For those of you who don't know, and I'm guessing that many of you don't, by the Supreme Court ruling of 1954 in Brown versus the Board of Education, um, we had some states, in particular Mississippi, southern states, but Mississippi glares, who refused to abide by the decision. Um, the Brown versus the Board of Education struck down segregation in schools. Um, in the 1960s, Mississippi still maintained separate and unequal white and colored school systems. On the average, the state spent $81.66 to educate a white student compared to $21.77 for black children. Um, Mississippi was one of the only two states in the Union that did not have a mandatory education law, and many children living in rural areas were sent to work in the field and got very little education at all. But even for those who were in school, even the educational curriculum for black kids was different. For example, the white school board of Bolivar County in Mississippi mandated that neither foreign languages nor civics be taught in Negro schools, nor shall American history from 1860 to 1875 be taught. So they took out a nice little chunk of history. Kids didn't learn anything about civics, which gives you an understanding of voting rights and the rights of citizens. But in late 1963, Charles Cobb, a student nonviolent coordinating committee activist, proposed the organization sponsor a network of freedom schools. And freedom schools managed to take hold. Some are still in place today. Some of the elementary and middle schools and even high schools still maintain names which were from that time. Because uh, Dr. Nisa Muhammad decided that she was going to extend this concept specifically for African American Muslims, I am going to introduce her. I think I am. Let me see. She does too many things. She is a Howard University Assistant Dean for Religious Life. She's responsible for religious programming, advocates for religious needs of Muslim students, faculty, and staff. She teaches non academic classes on the Islamic tradition and works closely as a part of the staff in the Office of the Dean of the Chapel to foster interfaith dialogue and cooperation. She is also president of the Association of Muslim Chaplains. She is a recent graduate from Howard University School of Divinity with a Doctor of Ministry degree in Sacred Text and a PhD student in Howard University in the African Studies. Talk about somebody that's busy. Welcome and salams, Dr. Nisa. Hi.
Walaikum salam. Thank you for having me. And so today I'm here as the internship coordinator for Sapelo Square, which
Okay,
is,
so do the
yes,
whole thing.
which is the host of the Freedom School. And the Freedom School is the idea of the founder of Sapelo Square, Dr. Suwa Kabir, who wanted to be able to offer learning for liberation to our community. So Sapelo Square is an online resource for Black Muslims that offers a range of subject matter from arts and culture to religion to history to politics and religion. And on the site, you can find a wealth of information about Black Muslims. And so, looking at the time and where we are, she really wanted to be able to offer something for our community that they could have access to Black Muslim scholars. And so typically many in our community do not have access to a variety of Black Muslim scholars. And so Freedom School, just like it was in the 1960s, provided access to learning for liberation to our community. Today's Freedom School through Sapelo Square provides access to our community to a wealth of information to a range of Black Muslim scholars that typically they would not have access to.
Why?
Why don't they have access to them? Well, for a lot of the students that are in our school, they have limited education. They're young. Some of them are in college. Some of them are not in college. Some of them don't go to schools where these professors teach, and so they don't have access to them. And so that is what our main function, our main one of our main goals was to be able to give students access to these professors to bring marginalized learning to the center.
So, how did you? Oops! Look at my glasses. Oh my goodness! How about this? How did you set up? I mean, well, how did you conceive of how this was going to go?
So really, again, just want to thank the brilliancy of Chapel Square's founder, Dr. Suwa Kabir, because she really had the idea of having this as a freedom school format to really look at the goals and objectives of what freedom school offered then and transform those ideas and to make it very contemporary today, so that not only do we have classes, but just to offer people seminars and classes is not enough, because you can take a class from somebody and find it. There's so many classes that are offered today, but that's not enough. But we are following a freedom school format where our students are going to also produce a final project or final product at the end of their learning, so that it's in addition to their learning, they're going to also connect the word with the world. What does this learning mean? What does it mean to you as a Muslim? What are you going to get out of this learning? And so, in addition to the classes that they are taking, they're going to have a supplemental class on Saturdays to really kind of process what they are learning, process what they have experienced, to make it have meaning to them and who they are as a student in Freedom School.
Wow, I'm excited.
Good. We're excited to have you.
Um, how many courses?
We're offering 4 courses by 4 esteemed professors: Dr. Bilal Ware, Dr. Yusuf Carter, Dr. Suad Abdul Kabir, and of course, you, Dr. Amina Aldin.
Don't say, of course, you. Say that with some oomph in the voice. You know.
Well, there's definitely oomph in the voice.
I will come back to you. But Dr. Carter, um, can let me first get my glasses. This is going to be fun. Um, Let me tell our audience a little bit about you. Dr. Carter has just joined as an assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, uh, and is much welcome. And he's a Kenan Rafai Fellow in Islamic Studies. He holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of California, Berkeley, and is an expert in Sufism and Islam in West Africa and the United States. His book, In Progress, The Vast Oceans, Remembering God and Self on the wait a minute, I'm going to mess this up. Mustafai, Mustafawi,
Mr. Fowler.
yeah, Mustafawi, Sufi
Mhm.
path, examines the discourses and practices of a transatlantic Sufi spiritual network through detailed ethnographic work. He has previously held a postdoc at Harvard and received certificates in teaching excellence, etc. Too long already, which means that the next time I interview you, I'm going to have everything in front of me. All right, Dr. Carter, you are going to be teaching in the Freedom School.
Yes.
What,
So
before I do that, what are you teaching for UNC in Chapel Hill?
yeah. So before I begin, Assalamu alaikum.
Or
Let me just say that thank you for having me on. It's certainly a pleasure and an honor to be speaking with you all. Um, so the courses that I'm teaching at UNC, of course, um, this is my first month as a faculty member, but in the fall I'll be teaching a course entitled African American Islam. And so in the spring, I'll be teaching a course on ethnicity, race, and religion in America, as well as a course entitled Re-Understanding Islam. And so those are essentially the courses that I'm going to be teaching for the year. Um, and so generally, the courses that I teach have to do with the intersections between race and religion, focusing in on politics of the African diaspora, pretty much the sort of sphere within the work that I do, particularly looking at African American and African Muslims, particularly in the Sufi context, with regard to my own research.
wait,
However, I
stop right
won't claim to be an yes.
there. When you say African American Muslims in a Sufi
hmm
context, say more.
hmm Yeah. So I was about to say that I want to just put on the table that I don't identify as an expert. I don't know who wrote that, but it was not me.
Uh,
Um,
we
and that's
got
a
you
yeah.
now.
So, but anyway, yeah. So essentially, my work looks at a Sufi network, right, called the Mustafawi Tariqa, right, that originates in Senegal and has roots in the American South. And so I'm interested in the ways in which discourses of mobility, repatriation, history, memory, all play a part in the sort of the mapping and tracing of this community. So, for example, I think about how um, visits from South Carolina, which is where one of the major or main communities is located. Visits from South Carolina to Senegal take place, and the meanings in which those visits take place. So, for example, it's particularly meaningful for Muslims of African descent who um, are living in the United States, were born in the United States, identify as African American and or Black, and so there's all these sort of discourses of repatriation and return, heritage tourism that are coupled with spiritual tourism. And so visiting the grave of the founding Sheikh Mohammed Mustafa Gai Haidara, entails sort of disembarking um, in Dakar, right? And sort of making one's way over to chess, right? And so one of the things that happens as African American Muslims, in particular, are first visit Senegal at the encouragement and invitation of their Sheikh Haroun Fai. He encourages them to visit Goree Island, for example,
Mhm.
to visit the Misa del Slav, right?
Well,
Um,
you got to tell our audience what visiting Goree Island is.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So certainly, so Goree Island is an island off the coast of Dakar that was a port of exit for West African Muslims and non-Muslims who would engage or be sort of forcibly taken from the shores of West Africa into the Americas to be made to labor on behalf of a sort of a racial capitalist project. Um, and so I'm interested in how performance, for example, of the Mustafawi spiritual training regimen that entails the Sufi chants, zikr, for example, can be mapped onto discourses about a return to a particular kind of self. So I think about reversion, for example. So often
I
in
hate
the African
the
American
word.
Muslim
I
lexicon,
hate the word. Hate.
why do you hate the word?
Because it sounds like a prison term, and it's not
Mm.
wholly accurate in the sense
Mm-hmm.
that I'm challenging you now. That
That's fine. Yeah.
black people are always
Mm-hmm.
spiritual, even in the depth of
Mm-hmm.
despair and brutality. They may
Yeah.
not have
Yeah.
the liquor, which is a
Mm-hmm.
remembrance, is kind of more so a reconnection,
Mm-hmm.
because it's there. It didn't go anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's me.
Yeah. So you're right. Yeah. No,
Professor
I
on the
agree.
block now. You can just say,
No, no, no. No, no, no. I'm not. So I'm using. I use the term. I want to rescue the term actually, and use it in a different way. So there, in the sort of traditional or historical African American Muslim lexicon, reversion is a term. Obviously, as we all know, is used to think about and articulate a return to the faith of Islam.
yeah.
Um, and most of the time when it's used in a kind of a spiritual connotation in terms of thinking about how the
Mm,
fitra for the human being is one that is submitted to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And so reverting to Islam is literally a return to this sort of state of submission for the person, right? And in this case, the African American Muslim. But I want to think about it as a diasporic terminology, right? In terms of thinking about, particularly in the American South, South Carolina, Charleston,
mm,
for example, which was a very important and significant port of entry for enslaved Africans, Muslims as well, African Muslims as well. There's a way in which people who conceive of themselves or think of themselves as they sort of enter into the faith or were already Muslim and get introduced to this particular configuration of Islamic spirituality. There's
mm,
this sort of notion of a kind of a return to a lost self, right? And this is connected to a sort of broader history of African American Muslim practices and identity. So, for example, this is the reason why the Nation of Islam was, called the lost found Nation of Islam, right?
right,
This notion of more science temple as well, right? Another
right,
um, examples, right? People sort of conceiving of themselves as returning to a way of seeing um, themselves, the world, and the otherworldly that they are sort of reconnecting with, right? And so there's also this question of reconnecting across the Atlantic,
mm,
not just in terms of thinking about a faith, but also thinking about the reconnection of peoples, right? So enslaved Africans weren't just torn from their land; they were torn from their families. They were torn from from their traditions, torn from their languages, their foodways, right? And so there's this question of a reconnection to the land, as well as a reconnection to people. And so I mean, of course, I have yet to finish writing the book, but I'm attempting to sort of think about the question of reversion more deeply, to pull it to use it as a diasporic grammar, as well as um, sort of deploying its spiritual connotations, which is essentially sort of a microcosm of what I'm doing in the book as well. Yeah.
well, one of the things Nisa and I uh, attended, of course, remotely, a Muslim mental health conference this weekend.
Hmm.
And one of the things that came out was trying to uh, use old Islamic thinkers and
Hmm.
extend that thinking. And one of the things
Hmm.
that occurred to me, which connects directly with what you're doing, is could we say that, because both of you all are thinking about spiritual stuff, that there is a disconnect and an overfeeding of one part of the triad between the soul, the heart, and the mind, and these little
Hmm.
hoodlums that get out here and are shooting everybody because there's no reason there, right? It's as
Mm.
if there is a
Mm.
serious unbalance for which a
Hmm.
thicker could calm you down and give your body It has to be persistent, but to calm you down and give your body a chance to readjust, because that's what's missing. And
Yeah, I would.
African
Mhm.
American Islam, the Salafi got their feet in the door first and
Mm,
made all kinds of moves to keep those who understood and used the Sufi traditions, various ones of them, out.
mm,
Yeah, fascinating stuff. I hate
yeah.
version.
Well, hopefully you won't hate reading my book, but
No, well, you know what? What? No, I won't. But what it is that there is a hegemonic Christian vocabulary. It starts with
hmm
convert, then it goes to revert, and I don't know what comes after revert, but it
mm,
is so steeped in another cosmology
hmm
that it makes it difficult. I'm just
mm,
saying.
perhaps. Yeah, but I mean, I'm also sort of want to be sensitive to the terms that people use. So you have a lot of people that refer to themselves. They use the term revert.
Well, they use it
Um,
because people keep telling them.
yeah, I mean,
Your job as the scholar is to shape and change and restructure
um,
stuff. I'm gonna mess with you till you drop. Anyway,
no, I'm not gonna drop. I mean, well, so that's the thing. I mean, in terms of thinking about scholarship, there are multiple ways in which to think about what that means. I don't necessarily see myself as someone who has a responsibility to shape people's thinking. I think I have
but
a
you do,
responsibility
you
to.
do.
I mean, yes, in a certain
Yes,
way, but
yes,
at the same time, I think it's important for the scholar to recognize that we don't know everything. I mean, at least that's how I feel. I mean,
right,
whenever I enter the classroom space, I make it quite clear that I do not enter the space as the sole possessor of knowledge. We
right,
all have something to contribute, and
right.
so there's a way in which people understand. Like, for example, when I took my shahada, when I came to Islam, um, one of the things that pulled me into the faith was this voice that came from somewhere that in which I felt as though I was the space that I inhabited in that moment in the masjid was somehow vaguely familiar, even though I had never been in a masjid before.
Mm.
The way in which the kind of scenery of the khutbah and the bodily posture of the Muslims in that space um, was something. It was like I remember describing that experience early on. This is about 20 years ago.
Mm.
Like stepping into a bath of warm water. Um, and so that
Okay,
question of
okay, okay.
return is an important one, I
Yeah.
think, for
No,
us.
but I think you're right. So, what are you teaching in the Freedom School? Did your classes start already?
Well, the first class meets tomorrow.
Okay, what are
Um,
you teaching?
so when I was first asked to participate, which I thank you to Dr. Muhammad for inviting me to be a part of this awesome project. Um, I thought about what makes the most sense, um, and considering what's happening now in the street, in the world, etc. Um, I wanted to sort of shape a discussion around Black Muslim activism writ large, but also think about the history of that. Think about activism amongst and within Black Muslim communities, amongst Black Muslims, right? In a contemporary context as well. So, just to sort of give you a rough outline of what we're doing, the first course is going to entail interrogating Black Muslimness. So, for example, what do we mean when we use the term Black Muslim? And who are we envisioning when we use that term, right? And so one of the reasons why I think that's important is because uh, aside from the sort of historical problematic nature of designating Black Muslims as opposed to and somehow different from Muslims, um, I think it's important to consider when we utter a term like Black Lives Matter. who we include in our idea of who is black. Because within certain communities that could be identified as black, um, there are sort of varying relationships to that term, right? Um, and then also at the same time, there's a way in which uh, Muslims who of African descent, whether they be African American, whether they be second generation, Somali American Muslims, Sudani, Senegalese, etc. There's in certain mosques, um, and especially African American Muslims, our Muslimness gets called into question,
Yeah. But
unfortunately.
I've been reading a couple of books where
Hmm.
written by African Muslims coming
Hmm.
here, and how they have to learn to be black because
Mm.
they're going to be pegged as black no matter what.
Yeah, 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 yeah. No, certainly. I mean, I think one of the interesting things about many of the communities, and in terms of their sort of respective histories, is when they post 1965, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, when they have moved to this country, there was a sort of a calculation made within those communities about who they and would align themselves with. In some
Yeah.
cases, they align themselves with the Muslims of African descent who were already here. In certain cases, they, especially those who bought into the lie about who black folks are,
Yeah.
right, sought to align themselves or not align themselves with black Muslims, and sort of engaging a certain kind of racial formation all along the way. And so what we're talking about is this sort of modeled minority pattern that many have sort of bought into and quickly found out that yes, you are black too, whether you like it or not.
And whether you like
Um,
it or not. Yeah.
yeah, and you are and have been treated as such. And so I think there's a kind of a fracturing or a fissure between that first generation and second generation Muslims of African descent who are not necessarily native to this country. Of course, using that term carefully. Um, and then
Yeah.
also that there's a heightened solidarity um, that I think occurs and has occurred over the last few decades, and um, so our first session is going to sort of talk about that, right? Interrogating Black Muslimness. What does Black Muslim mean to you, right? When you say Black Lives Matter, number one, does that mean all Black people, or does that mean the Black people that you're comfortable with, right? And this is a conversation that I
Comfort,
think is important for.
comfort, comfort.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's important to interrogate. I mean, we all and because here's the thing: when you say Black Lives Matter, when I say Black Lives Matter, when Dr. Muhammad says Black Lives Matter, right? We all can have different ideas about what those Black lives are, right? Or who's Black in that term, right? And who's deserving of a particular kind of um, sort of emphasis with regard to the question of political organizing and social justice. And so the second, and just stop me, obviously I'm taking up a lot of time, but my sort of second meeting is to sort of look at the history of Black Muslim activism briefly, and then talk specifically about a lesser known organization that I think is completely fascinating that doesn't get enough um, sort of discussion in our communities, and that's the Islamic Party in North America,
Yeah,
which,
on my reading list in my first reading. Make sure he gets the text if he doesn't already have it.
You know,
oh yeah, okay,
I'm fascinated by them also because a lot of them started at Howard University, and so I'm
right,
totally
yeah,
fascinated by
exactly,
them as well. Yeah.
yeah. And so this is just to sort of give a quick rundown for our listeners, our watchers. This is an Black Muslim led organization, predominantly Black Muslim led organization that was initiated in the late 60s, early 70s, headquartered in Washington, D.C., led by Yusuf Muzaffar Hamid, who was a jazz trumpeter, African American, studied overseas, moved back, um, and led this very sort of passionate group of African American Muslims who were politically astute. And so this is an organization of people in their, late teens, 20s,
True.
maybe, young folks. And so think about the equivalent would be like if the Black Panther Party were Muslims, and maybe minus the guns most of the time.
Wait,
But
I
I mean, you
remember
have people who were.
have Muzaffar on tape. A
Mm,
bunch of us were kicking back in his kitchen. So if you have a
mm.
VHS tape recording you wanted, you're welcome.
If you pass it to me, I will buy one because I mean I need that.
Right.
So we need to talk offline about that because I need some of that. But yeah, so you have this African American Muslim led organization that interprets Islam as necessitating action, right? Political
Yes.
action, right?
Yes.
And it's not resigned to sort of interpret or understand the faith of al-Islam as something that's just occurs in the mosque or something that you merely do with your body 5 times a day, right? But this is
Right.
rather something else entirely in which they take their political philosophy from Malcolm X,
Yeah.
as well as their organizational model from groups like Jamaati Islami in Pakistan, as well as Ikhwani Muslimin in Egypt, groups
Right.
in Palestine and Turkey, etc. And so they view themselves as this sort of northwestern or northwestern hemispheric, Western hemispheric component of a sort of global Islamic revolution that's popping off in the 60s and 70s, right? Fascinating, fascinating. And
Oh, I
so,
know. I used to
yeah,
know.
no, definitely. And so, I did my master's degree in history, and I wrote my thesis about the party. And so,
Send me
this is not
that
just from
thesis. Send
right.
me
So
that
from
thesis.
yes, ma'am. And so, for me, it's not just this sort of historical
Right.
thing. I engaged, I interviewed former party members. I've been a part of the sort of periphery of the Islamic Party family since then. And I've learned my understanding of Islam has been, undoubtedly shaped by the time I spent with play uncles and aunties, listening to their war stories, and
Right.
thinking about, this thing that they have been, you know, uh, blessed to be a part of that has forever shaped their lives and their understanding of their own faith. Um, and then so that's the second um, class meeting, and the third class meeting is where we start thinking about connecting faith and action, um, and the importance of thinking about what does it mean to be a Muslim? What does it mean to be a Muslim of African descent, or in other words, a Black Muslim, right? What does it mean to be a Black Muslim in this moment in this country?
Mm-hmm.
What are our marching orders? What is our responsibility? What are the things that we have to do? Um, if we say we believe, what does that mean, right? And so it follows that there are certain requirements of us as Muslims of African descent, that for those of us that profess to believe in an all-knowing, all-seeing higher power that commands us to enjoin the good, not necessarily, not just, and this is something that I've been thinking about lately, um, in terms of really delineating and thinking deeply about the difference between preventing harm and enjoining the good, right? Because
Yeah.
there's a difference. It's a different
Yeah, there is.
moral position that one takes, or an ethical position
Absolutely.
that one takes.
Yeah.
Often we find ourselves in a position where we're working to undo harm,
Right.
but there's a different spirit that one walks with when your mind and your body and your heart is focused on um, shaping and shifting society toward the good, right? Um, and so, yeah, these are things that I would want my students to, or
Oh, I
students, the
think
people who are in the class to think about, right?
it's gonna be
So more than shaping minds, I view myself as somebody who hopefully will help shape hearts. So,
Okay. Nisa, I see you
inshallah.
smiling and your eyes have lit up. Please jump in.
No, I'm so excited about this because I did my master's thesis on the history of Muslims at Howard University. And to do that, I had to talk about the Islamic Party because they're so
Mm-hmm.
integral to the history of Muslims at Howard University because a lot of the Muslims got started at Howard University in the Islamic Party. I mean, that was their whole
Right.
foundation to Islam was the Islamic
Mm-hmm.
Party. And the Islamic Party did a lot of dawah on Howard University's campus. And
Mm-hmm.
so I learned a lot about the Islamic Party. Been doing my master's thesis. I interviewed a lot of people in the Islamic Party for when I did my master's thesis. So to hear about that, and I'm totally fascinated by them. I mean, they
And
had a
Mm-hmm.
sector.
the article I sent you is by Hassan Bagby, who is
Yes,
very prominent in the Islamic Party.
right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
College Griggs, who was very
Yeah,
influential in the Islam Party, was a student at Howard University.
yeah,
He thought he was going to go to law school. He scrapped law school and worked in the Islamic Party. So
yeah.
no, that's why I was just
Yeah.
so very fascinated by that because, like I said, I did my master's thesis on the history of Muslims at Howard University, and it's just a lot of Muslims from Howard were totally involved in the Islamic Party. So that was just very good to hear.
Yeah. One of the things that, yeah,
I'm sorry.
I was
No,
just gonna say, just kind of
go.
bouncing off of what, sorry, bouncing off of what Dr. Muhammad just said. Um, when I talk to them, right, because I know a bunch of them. They were about it. They left school. They to for the dean, right, and to change the world.
Hmm.
Their position was let us change the world. It wasn't like let me deal with this one thing. There was an all encompassing vision for how they were going to
Right,
number one, Islamicize the world, right? Because it
Hmm.
was viewed as Islam was the panacea, right?
right,
Panacea for the world's social political ills.
right.
Um, yeah,
Yeah,
we need to connect on this
and
IPNA stuff.
they were
Join
so
forces.
so serious. One of the students told me, he said when he converted, and I used to converted reverted when he converted, his parents
Mm-hmm,
took him out of Howard University. His parents took him out of school because they were like, oh no, you're involved with this Muslim stuff. We're taking you out of Howard. He said
yeah.
he came out of school for a whole year, and when they saw that he was not changing, he was totally committed
Hmm.
to Islam. That they allowed him to come back to Howard, and then he
Yeah.
just
And also,
where he left off.
can I give another thing that connects to our freedom school discussion?
Hmm.
Nowadays, when someone sort of takes their shahada, um, generally the pattern is okay. Well, here's the Quran. This is how you make salat, etc., etc., etc. When you took your shahada and Masjid al Ummah, right, in DC, the 70s, affiliated with the Islamic Party, you already were immersed in a political education as well as
Hmm.
a religious and spiritual education, and I think that's something that also is important, and one of the salient things about the opportunity to do this sort of freedom school project now is to engage people politically, and view that as a sort of necessary organic part of the faith, right? So
And I think
definitely.
that's part of what's missing from traditional Western education where students are learning today. There's no connection with what they're learning and what it means for them in their life today as a Muslim. How does this empower me?
Right.
How does this make sense of my life? How does this make sense of who I am in the world today? And to bring up the Islamic Party and use that as an example of what they are and what they did is amazing because I'm pretty sure for a lot of students, they probably have never even heard of the Islamic Party.
Oh yeah, no, certainly,
Yeah.
certainly.
Well, I don't think that they see um, uh, the connections of dots. The map hasn't been drawn so that they can see steps in a foundation, and then like a large boulder being set there with immigrant Islam, which
Mm-hmm.
then and it's just learning it's Muslim, and there's kind of a disconnect. You know,
Mm-hmm.
Muslims don't quite know What is it I'm supposed to do now? I'm an active participant in this. And now you're telling me, no, you can't do that. No, you can't do this. No, you can't do the other. Provided a large disconnect. But let me ask both of you. So, what is your take on what we're to make about Black Lives Matter now? The protests are sporadic. Some
Hmm.
things are being pushed, whether it's about taking back some of the money from the police and putting it into schools and community services. People are trying to think deeply and quickly about what to do, and it's still happening about this mass of just I'll stand my ground and shoot you dead stuff.
Mm.
What do you think?
So I think for Black Muslims, I think Black lives have always mattered. And I
Yeah,
think we have sometimes got caught up in other cultures and other populations and have tried to follow their lead as opposed to
right,
knowing that for us, Black lives have always mattered. And that has what has got us where we are today because we've had to see that Black lives have always mattered, even in Islam. Black lives have always mattered. And I think these are crucial issues that we have to look at through a lens of Islam that factors in our own unique history and not someone
right,
else's history. And I think
right.
that's what we're trying to be able to get young people to see through Freedom School, that we have a unique history and that we have to use that history as a learning for liberation and not look at Islam through someone else's history and through someone else's lens.
Yusuf?
Yeah, certainly. So whenever I teach a course about African American Islam, one of the things, because it's usually, often that the students in that class is mixed company,
Right,
and so I have to get it across that um, one of the things that I say to them is that Black Muslims have always been Black.
Hmm.
And what I mean by that there is no point at which the sort of physical, structural, historical, cultural violences that impinge on Black life that Black Muslims have ever been insulated from
from,
that.
yeah,
Hmm.
And so, in order to understand the Black Muslim experience, you cannot do that without understanding the Black experience.
right,
Right.
Now, right. So, unfortunately, there are some of us, I think, that when we are in Muslim spaces, predominantly Muslim spaces, that are sort of, because of our whatever we got going on, we push that sort of Blackness to the side, or we sort of damp that down,
yeah,
as if um, my Blackness is somehow not worthy of being present, because that's not something can that we can sort of vibe on and connect on. And I think that's um, number one. I think that's a personal issue, right?
yeah,
That people need to sort of really reflect on and investigate. Like, why am I doing that? Because if you're in certain spaces, you have no problem being vocal, but when you're in some of these larger suburban mosques, and somehow, although you've been Muslim all of your life, your parents have been, whatever, you have a command of the deen, you are potentially not even worthy to, call the adhan or give the khutbah
right,
or
right.
to lead a
So,
class, right?
so where do you
You
think
can sweep the mat.
where do you
I'm
think
sorry.
these biases come from? Is it as simple as I don't really think you're Muslim because you're black, or is I don't know blacks to be educated because they're black,
Yeah. So
or
so
is
so
it a
yeah.
bundling of implicit biases?
So I think number one is a spiritual problem. That's it. Just put simply, it's a spiritual problem. It's a problem of the heart. Um,
Yeah,
find me a prominent Muslim institution that has not been built either directly or indirectly upon the labor of Black Muslims. The reason why certain uh, certain Muslim institutions can, solicit monies, funding, etc., build their masjids, is because of the fact that Islam was established in this country by Muslims of African descent.
Right.
And not just any kind of Muslims, Muslims who were unapologetically black,
Muslim.
unapologetically Muslim, right?
Right.
And so the biases that we speak of are, in my mind, in my understanding, a result of a number of factors. So, for communities that consist mainly of South Asian and Arab, Muslims, or South Asian Arabs, which is where I see most of um, the discrimination.
Right.
I said what I said. Um, I think that has to do with something to do with coloniality, right? Colonial baggage.
Mm.
That is to
But
say that
how
when
how do you get
so
someone who wants to have the best of intention to see
mhm.
deep seated bias?
Yeah, so I think that has to do with a willingness to listen, a willingness to learn, a willingness to be led by people who know better than you. If you want to understand the intricacies of what it means to be a citizen of this country or to be a second class citizen of this country, right? You are
About
not
that.
going to sort of mingle with, white folks, because they don't understand that experience. We understand what it means. You know, um, People have made the argument that we understand white folks better than they understand themselves.
Yeah. What do you think,
Um,
Lisa? Hold on 1 second.
yeah.
What do you think, Lisa?
No, I totally agree. I totally agree. I was speaking at a masjid at a that has a school, and I was speaking to the whole high school community, and I said, your community, hails Malcolm X and talks so highly of Malcolm X is your hero, but how many in your community would have Malcolm X do a khutbah? Could Malcolm X come and give a talk to your high school students? How many of you would let your sons marry Malcolm X's daughters? Exactly. Malcolm X couldn't even walk in the door. You would
Right.
not even welcome him in, and they were dumbfounded. They couldn't give a
Mm,
response because that's the kind of implicit bias that this. It's okay to worship and hail him because he's dead and gone, but if
Right.
he was right here in your
mm,
face, you couldn't say anything. I spoke last night to a high school group. I don't know if you've heard of MIST. MIST is this Muslim interscholastic scholarship tournament thing for young Muslim high schools, predominantly immigrant groups. And so I was speaking to a high school group on the Black Muslim student experience. So my icebreaker was, let's name some Black Muslim scholars. Let's name some Black Muslim imams. Let's name some Black Muslim thought leaders. Let's see if you can name 10 of them, and they couldn't name 5. It was like, raise your hands.
mm,
Who could you come up with? And I mean, they couldn't name anybody. And that just shows they are so disconnected from who Black Muslims are. I mean, they just don't know anybody. They couldn't even say
yeah.
Ibtihaj Muhammad, who was an
So
Olympian. I mean, they couldn't even name there.
let me ask a different question. If how you think and what you do, I don't do the hard thing, but I'm gonna work on it. Um, is divorced from the Quran. Who are you?
Say that one more time,
If how
please.
you think and what you
Hmm.
do and what you hold dear is divorced from the Quran, who are you?
Mm, yeah, yeah. A boat
That's
without an
that's
oar,
right.
Mm,
subject to whatever the seas are going to do.
wow. Well, needless
That's, I
to
mean, that's
say,
the simplest I can put it.
as we move through the Freedom School, I'm going to drag you all back because I'm learning so much. I got more notes, and gee, I got to organize my notes so I can have something to go back to. But I think it is such an honor to have both of you talking about stuff, some of which I've contemplated, but much of what I've never thought about. Uh,
Mm,
until I've heard one or the other of you talk about it. and then the wheels, get the cobwebs off and they start moving along. But I think that some of the stuff we need to go back to, because I want to talk about the absence of our voices in places where if this was the 60s and the 70s, it would have been up front. And
Mm,
why have they receded to the margins? So if you will
mm.
entertain me, I will certainly call you back. This is Critical Talk. Hasn't been long enough with Professor Amin Dean, Dr. Nisa Muhammad, and Dr. Yusuf Carter. And I can't, we've learned so much this evening. Thank you for taking your time. I'm just excited. I'm just excited.
We're excited as well.
Yeah.
Thank
Yes,
you for
thank
having us.
you.
Thank you. Inshallah, stay around.